Greetings and salutations. And it's the show with Mel Rias. This is your host, Mel Rias. Welcome back to the podcast. Tonight's topic: what is a witch? Now, you might think, hey, I think it's kind of obvious what a witch is. But in some of my studies recently, I would say that that definition has at least been challenged in my mind, so I might also challenge your definition of the word. So I have been pursuing and studying spiritual and religious pursuits my whole life. It's a lifelong passion of mine. And over the last couple years, I've been reading up on witchcraft and the occult and things of that nature. And a lot of people don't realize that things have really changed in the last couple hundred years. I'm not talking about our moral compass. I'm talking about how we apply words. And what do I mean by this? Well, as I've been reading through ancient religious practices and witchcraft and things of that nature, I understand that, like, in the last 100 years or so, there has been a revival in paganism. And the pagans, modern day pagans, neo-paganism, there's not an insignificant portion of this group that decided to just own the word witch and apply it to themselves and just kind of repurpose it. But I think people forget that, historically speaking, the word witch is not something someone would be proud of or apply to themselves. And I'm specifically talking about its historical use. We look at things that witchy people do, and we just kind of umbrella it, because that's the world we were born into. We kind of umbrella all of that together. The herbs and the tarot cards and the pentagrams and things of this nature. But again, a lot of this is a result of the revival of the last couple hundred years. I would challenge you to look back through the scriptures and to see some of the things that take place. I look at Jesus making clay with his spit and healing a man's eyes, or Paul anointing a cloth and using that as a point of contact to heal someone who was long distance from him. When Moses made the waters the bitter waters clean with the tree branch that he tosses in there. In today's view, in today's modern culture and also modern Christianity, using a material object to incorporate in your prayer is basically considered spell work today. But historically, that's just kind of what people did. It wasn't considered anything. It wasn't considered a spell. It was just a physical representation of the prayer being uttered. And herbology, today we know science and chemistry, but to the ancient peoples, they just understood that plants had properties. Now, whether they considered it magical or not, I think is immaterial. They just considered the plant had properties. Well, that's not dissimilar from a lot of witchcraft today. A lot of witchcraft is herbology. this plant has this magical purpose, that plant has that magical purpose. But this isn't something that was specifically to the witch, you know, historically speaking. Historically speaking, someone who was a witch is someone who practiced magic and outside of the cultural norms and conversed with different gods. You know, that's a lot of what it came down to. And historically, a witch was someone who cursed people. They were villainous, if you will. Think more black magic is what a witch really was back in the day. Now, a modern day witch might argue with me and say, well, what about the hedge witch, who is just, you know, the eccentric lady? I'm not talking about that. I'm not talking about that. And you would find that if you went back in history, the people of the town might call that woman witchy, but they weren't really quick to burn her at the stake, because unless she was like turning people into frogs, that's what they considered witchcraft, you know, or consorting with Satan. That was considered witchcraft. Now, that's not what it is today. Witchcraft is not Satanism today. It's not. I'm not trying to make that connection. I'm saying in our modern time, modern pagans have repurposed the word. And so the word means something else now, and I respect that. But I'm saying historically, witch meant something else. Which brings me to the question today is, what do you consider a witch? You know? Like, personally, I do not consider myself a witch. By my own definition that I use based on what I see in the ancient world. You know, it's interesting in the Western languages, particularly in English, we like to call things by what they appear to us. You know, it looks like this, so we'll call it a this. But in ancient Hebrew, a lot of the words, the association was more what something did than how something appeared. Let me give you an example. The word for horse in Hebrew is sus. No, I don't remember the other word that it comes from. But the word for horse in Hebrew is more related to a flight animal than it would be to like another land mammal. So we like associate cows and horses. The Hebrew mind, the ancient Hebrew mind, associated the horse to the bird because of the way it moves. It's like the bird of the land, or the bird is like the horse of the wind, because they both move like sus. You know, they both move in a particular way. And so by that, if I go by definition by what a thing does, you know, I would not consider myself a witch, but I think other people might, just by the simple fact that I use tarot cards. But I don't consider myself a witch. And I'm not saying that it's bad. It's interesting how the use of the word has changed over time. And so I think that is something that we have to take into consideration when we look at scripture and everything. And what practices we condemn and what practices we don't, and where they come from. There is a large portion of there is a large portion of modern witchcraft that is indistinguishable from folk medicine that our ancestors used. Certain forms of divination were not uncommon amongst common people, making that also folk. So yeah, it's an interesting question. What is a witch? And what would you consider a witch? Another interesting thing is the pentagram. In modern witchcraft, the pentagram represents the five elements: the air, earth, water, fire, and spirit. But in medieval times, the pentagram represented the 5 wounds of Christ: his hands, his feet, and the side where he was pierced by the spear. And so again, that's something that was repurposed, And again, I'm not saying that modern paganism is wrong and how it's reapplying these words and symbols. I'm just saying that when we're discussing these things, that these are variables that we have to take into consideration. The book of Samuel is very specific about what the witch of Endor was guilty of. So like certain things in scripture are condemned, obviously interacting with other gods is against the Torah, against the commandments. Astrology is also something that is talked about quite specifically in the Old Testament. And necromancy. The witch at Endor in the book of Samuel, she's specifically performing necromancy, which is speaking to the dead. And that's another thing that the Bible, if you're a Christian, that's something that the Bible talks about. But at the same time, every time you see in Samuel where David inquires of the Lord, it's pretty well implied that the lots were probably used, especially when you consider the nature of the question and the answer. The questions and answers that come, the questions that are asked when David inquires and the answers that come back could very well be the result of yes or no questions. Now, we don't know for sure how the lots in the Old Testament worked. But it was probably a yes or no system. So when you hear that David went before the ephod, remember the Urim and the Thummim was in the ephod, and this was probably some kind of lot system. So David inquires of the spiritual realm, which you can call divining. He goes to the priests and they do it in accordance with what Yahweh allows, and Saul specifically does it in the way that isn't. And the comparisons of Saul and David are all very much not so much what is being done, but the spirit in which it is being done. I mean, yes, it is important what is being done, but it's also as important, God specifically says when picking David that he was looking for a man after his own heart. So we have 2 examples of spiritual inquiry. But it's the method and the audience of who the psychic is talking to, if you will, determines the holiness of the action. And again, I'm only bringing this up to re-examine how we look at the word witch, and to remember that the people who have reclaimed the word, a lot of what they do is things that most people did back then, when we didn't have an understanding of medicine that we do today, or chemistry. In a world like that, everything is a little magical. And I'm not saying that we believe in a God of the gaps, but when you don't know anything, magic and the spiritual realm become the answer to everything, because it's the only thing you have to turn to. But anyways, but even with an understanding and a knowledge of chemistry and biology and things of this nature, But there's nothing in the Old Testament that says you can't use physical symbols to represent your prayer, even though by today's standard that would automatically be viewed as a spell. I'm saying that Moses wouldn't consider it a spell when he used physical items in his prayers, if you will, which again by today's standard would be basically a spell. So that's going to kind of wrap up all the talk we have today about what is a witch. It's something to think about. Malraius's musings is one of my musings. And this brings us to the second half of today's episode of the show. And without much of a break, that brings us to the second half of our show, and that's on my paternal side, there are some Appalachian, depending on what area you come from. There's some roots there, and in my studies, this actually got me interested in Appalachian witchcraft, which is a thing. I'm right into it, and again, this is one of those where a lot of that practice is just herbology and attributing properties to plants. There's more to it than that. It does get a bit magical, and they do have connections to conjure, and they do have connections to traditional Irish superstitions. Some of them believe in the wee folk. So if you want to believe in the wee folk, and by that I mean the fairies, which they don't prefer to be called, there's an entrance there for that. But again, it's interesting, as even though I'm kind of moving on to the topic of Appalachian witchcraft in particular, and the Appalachian experience in particular, that a lot of that still falls under folk medicine, folk traditions, folk superstitions, but repackaged in the modern world with our understanding of science, it comes across as magic and witchcraft. And you can consider it such if that's what you want to do. I mean, I'm not saying you can't. I'm just making an argument on both sides here to how are we going to actually define these words? Where do we make the line? It's amusing. Not amusing. It is a musing that I am having. So what's interesting is one night I went on Reddit and I posted a thread which blew up very quickly, started to blow up very quickly, and I deleted it before I went further because I realized I'd kind of embarrassed myself. And I hadn't really phrased myself well. But I was trying to find an entrance of connection in using my distant relations to try to make a point of entry, to have some kind of connection, I think, especially as I was learning about these superstitions, or these traditions, or this magic, or whatever you want to call it. And I hadn't considered that, the fact that I am connected to these people. I'm not one of them, but I'm connected enough to know about them. I should have instinctually known that they very much are not accepting of outsiders. If there's anything I knew or heard growing up about my kin in the hollers, was you ain't part of them anymore because you didn't grow up there. And just because you got blood don't mean you're part, you know what I'm saying? Some of the things that I was picking up from some of the traditions that are handed down, I recognized some of these things, and because they were passed down to us. A lot of them weren't, because our family comes from like Foursquare holiness, so a lot of things were omitted or not carried on because our particular family didn't hold those traditions. But there still were things. There still were things that were passed on. I come from a very spiritual people, you know. And I'm not talking specifically about the Appalachian. I'm talking about like the family that I come out. You know, a lot of stuff has happened in the history of our family. I'll just put it that way. But yeah, it's interesting, the whole thing. And I didn't even know when I started off that Appalachian witchcraft was even a thing to begin with, you know. But it's curious, and like I said, a lot of it's just herbology. And of the things that I do hold an interest in when it comes to these things, herbology isn't one that I really jump to, you know. And probably mostly because it wasn't part of the upbringing. I grew up in a world where people didn't see the point in remembering what the ancestors thought this plant did or that plant did, which maybe it did and maybe it didn't. I believe in folk wisdom, don't get me wrong, but we've proven that placebo is a powerful effect. So who knows when it comes to that? I mean, obviously opium is a painkiller, and that's not a placebo. So a lot of these herbs actually do have an effect, but some of these things could just be it's having the effect because you believe it has that effect. And intent is a lot of what goes into what you would call magic today. But I think what's important in this day and age with those kinds of things, with those traditions, is to do try to keep alive the ones that you had. We just came out of a time in history, for like probably the first time in history, where just as a country and maybe even as a species, we just wholeheartedly we found science and we wholeheartedly just dropped all of it, all of the traditions from before, failing to see the utility that they served, that they still serve. Science explains a lot, but it doesn't explain everything. And there are still questions that can only be found through spiritual paths. And those traditions, while we view them as quaint, still hold hidden wisdom. Now, it's hard for me to adopt a lot of herbology. I mean, I can to a degree, but I'm never going to become a great green herbologist. But I can adopt those things that I did grow up with. And that doesn't mean that people can't adopt those kinds of things even if they didn't grow up with it, but it's different, you know. I think it's because you just have that affinity within you to begin with, you know. But I never had that affinity, and I never had the tradition. So I'm probably not going to make that part of my tradition. Also, I'm sorry if you're hearing construction in the background, but across the street there's stuff going on. I know I'm bringing this up at the end of the episode, and I should have brought it up at the beginning, but here we are. And we're bringing this one to a close, and somehow we've gotten onto the topic of tradition. And I think it is important. You know, I talked last episode about a lot of the things that I had gone through, and you know, I'm trying to make things new and live in the now. And I find by doing that, there's a great utility in going through the old storehouse of the traditions that you were exposed to a greater or lesser degree, and piecing together from that and other things that you have picked up along the way to make your own tradition. Like, one of the traditions that I have, and this isn't so much like a, you know, folk tradition or a spiritual tradition, but I try to watch, you know, all my favorite Universal monster movies come Halloween time. That's what led to this last October me putting out all those shorts on Universal monster movies. That was a tradition that I decided to adopt. And it's also an example of something I didn't grow up with. I didn't grow up with Halloween. But it was something that I was exposed to and I always wanted to be a part of. And so now I'm making up for lost time. And I only just a week or so ago took down the last of my Halloween decorations. So I left them up for a while. Anyways, I think at this point I'm rambling. And though we're at 27 minutes, I think it's time to go ahead and wrap it up. But I will see you on the flip side, and I hope you've enjoyed the show, and hope you've got some things to think about. Mel Reyes signing out.